This is Saturn Girl. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Comment below because I want to know what you think. And it helps me out with the algorithm. Also do me a favor and click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And my videos are the best. Duh. Well, anyway, why are we even here? There is a momentous transit going on. Yesterday, in fact, Pluto, our Pope of Power, stationed direct in Capricorn. Yes, I know I'm late doing this video, but I've had a lot going on, so back off! Well, anyway, you may know that Pluto has been retrograde since May 1st of this year. And he had just dipped into Aquarius March 23rd. And then he stationed retrograde and went back into Capricorn June 11th. And if you recall, back in June, I did a video about Pluto retrograde, along with your horoscopes. So I suggest you go back and give it a gander, because there may be some interesting stuff I said in there. And it would be nice to know if I was accurate at all, you know? But I know it's the past. You know, we've got to let the past be the past. We've got to live here. We've got to be here now. We've got to be present. We've got to let love rule. That was Lenny Kravitz, but you know. Well, anyway, firstly, what is retrograde motion? What is direct motion? What do these words mean? So anyway, retrograde motion is the apparent motion, as seen from Earth, where a planet appears to move backwards through the zodiac, right? Whereas direct motion is the normal or usual motion, right? Of planets going through the zodiac, you know, counterclockwise, whereas retrograde is clockwise. It probably looks backwards on film here, you know, because I don't know. I'll have to figure that out another time. But we know that planets don't move backwards, don't we? They'll orbit the sun in the same direction, right? But at different speeds, right? You see, Pluto is called a superior planet, meaning it's further from the sun than Earth is. And superior planets move a lot slower. In fact, Pluto moves much slower. In fact, Pluto's orbital period is 248 years, right? Meaning that the last time he was in the same position was, you know, back in the late 1700s. So, I mean, superior planets, who do they think they are? Stupid superior planets think they're so great. Screw them. Well, anyway. So this means as the Earth approaches Pluto, like approaching a conjunction, right? Pluto will appear to slow down and eventually stop and then move backwards. So, of course, these planets are way further away, but let's say this is the Earth and let's say this is Pluto. So as the Earth approaches Pluto, he will appear to move backwards, right? And when the Earth gets far enough away, then Pluto will appear to move direct again, right? So, in fact, it's interesting to note that any superior planet will go retrograde as it is approaching a trine to the sun, or rather the sun is approaching a trine to it. So, in fact, if you have any superior planet opposite the sun in your chart, it will be retrograde. It will always be retrograde. And that's just the synodic cycle of superior planets, which we'll talk about another time. Well, so what does Pluto mean in astrology? Pluto is the Greek god of the underworld. You might be saying, well, what about Hades? Isn't Hades the god of the underworld? That's a funny story. Well, over time, the name Hades became more and more associated with the place and less associated with the god, right? In fact, the appellation Pluto slowly replaced Hades, in terms of the guy who actually rules the place, right? You see, there was another Greek god named Plutus, who was the personification of wealth. He also ruled buried treasures and precious items hidden below the earth. He also became associated with power and corruption. Because what does wealth tend to do, right? So, well, hence Pluto and Plutus were conflated together in a mutual set of significations. To me, though, the most proper treatment of Pluto in astrology is in the Alice Bailey books, particularly Esoteric Astrology. But we even see these same consistent themes happening in the Greek mythology. So, what are these things? Number one, will or power. We see Pluto associated with that, don't we? And this whole power signification spans the good and the bad. For example, we could see people who challenge power, or those who abuse it, and others. We see domination, force, forcing your intentions on others. Another theme is wealth and hoarding, right? I think of Ebenezer Scrooge, The US has Pluto in the second house. And think of all the prevailing refrain that we hear from conservatives. It's my money. It's mine. Low taxes. Screw everybody else. It's mine. It's mine. Right? Well, you could even call the US a plutocracy, which means you get political influence through buying it, right? Only the wealthy get real power. So, and that word, plutocracy, comes from Pluto. We also see psychological issues, don't we? Like, I think of American Psycho, where he's like, ah. Well, what's interesting about the psychological thing is Pluto was discovered in 1930. And this was just following Sigmund Freud's works on the ego and the id. And the id, right, is one of the three components of the psyche. It's like the inner beast, right? It's the hunger. I don't know if you remember the old Snickers commercials. There's a hunger inside you. Well, that's the id, right? The id is like, I want you to me and feed me. F me and feed me. That's, that's the id. So, we also think of kink and sexual deviance and perversion, right? Why? Probably because of Freud, really. Either that or perhaps someone's misunderstanding of him. But Pluto's meaning also got conflated with Scorpio, didn't it? You see, modern astrologers assigned Pluto rulership over Scorpio, which I don't really recognize because I only use traditional rulers. Mars rules Scorpio, as far as I'm concerned, not Pluto. But modern astrologers did assign him thusly. They almost assigned him to Aries because they were going in sequence. You see, when Uranus was discovered, he was assigned to the next sequential sign after Saturn's rulership. They just left Saturn with, Capricorn. And then they said, well, let's switch it for Aquarius. Let's put Uranus there. And then they discovered Neptune, and they put Neptune in Pisces, which was the next sequential sign. It just seemed to fit okay, too. Well, and then when Pluto was discovered, the first thought was the next sequential sign, which was Aries. But modern astrologers were all like, the Pluto symbolism doesn't really fit or complement Aries, does it? So they thought, well, Pluto, underworld, duh, Scorpio. And then we see the meanings get sort of, muddied and conflated and intermixed. Well, but what about Pluto retrograde? We talked about several main themes last time, didn't we? We talked about reversals of power. We talked about exposures of corruption. We talked about the demons in the depths of our psychology. You know, including abusive themes, right? We also talked about nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in general. So Pluto, in fact, was discovered, right, at the eve of the atomic age, just before the creation of the atomic bomb. So it's fitting that we see these themes accompanying him and his transits. Well, what happened during this Pluto retrograde? There were a lot of Plutonian events, but we're just going to focus on a few. So number one, in terms of corruption and exposure, and even reversals of power, Trump's legal trouble definitely was paramount and eclipsed many other events during this time. So it was on May 9th, right, just after Pluto went retrograde, that Trump was found guilty of abusing, you know what word I'm saying, right? Abusing a woman named E. Jean Carroll. And she was awarded a good amount of money from him as well. Well, and then, right, the Trump indictment. So the first major indictment was unsealed on June 9th, 8th or 9th, I believe. It had 37 counts or charges, right? All related to the classified documents case, or what Trump would call the boxes hoax. It's the boxes hoax, my beautiful boxes. Oh my goodness, my boxes. It's a hoax, folks. Sorry. Well, over the course of Pluto retrograde, Trump would accumulate more indictments and more charges, which I think now have totaled 91. And he was just recently found guilty of fraud in New York as well. And that could result in the consequence of him not being able to do business in New York anymore. The whole state of New York. Which, I mean, that's his state, right? So this would not be fun for him. Well, like I said, this is a big reversal of power. But now Republicans are talking about making Trump the Speaker of the House. Like, for real? I mean, you don't have to be a member of Congress, technically, to be the Speaker. But this would be absolute insanity. A ticking time bomb waiting to go off. So let's see how it goes. Now, also during that time, Ron DeSantis launched his presidential campaign challenging Trump, which is sort of like a reversal of power, right? But silly Elon Musk convinced DeSantis to make his announcement on Twitter, or I guess what people are calling X now. Like, yeah, anyway. I'm going to move on. I don't want to touch the whole X thing. But the whole Twitter announcement was an unmitigated disaster. It was awful. Like, there was even a bunch of photos of Elon Musk that were playing over DeSantis speaking. Like what? You know? Well, and little Rob DeSantis, he's a Libra Mars. Poor little Rob. No one likes you, little Rob DeSantis. In fact, you just have to just deal with the fact that everyone's making fun of you. Well, little Rob's campaign is now pretty much done, isn't it? By the end of Pluto retrograde. So it was like he announced at the beginning and he sort of gave up at the end. Just interesting to see the reversal of power wasn't really very much a reversal. It was sort of like an entertaining thought for a second. Well, the other interesting thing about this is that the other Republican candidates in the so-called primary also filed their documents to run while Pluto was retrograde. You know, that includes Chris Christie, Mike Pence, I think Vivek Ramaswamy, I don't remember. Anyway. On a side note, around, during the same transit, Elon Musk stepped down as CEO of Twitter on May the 12th. right? And this was amidst criticism of how he was running the company into the ground and all of his wacky tweets with all sorts of misinformation that were pissing off board members on the one hand and advertisers on the other. Not a very good idea. Not a very good idea. Well, also in July, the US resumed indirect negotiations with Iran regarding their nuclear program. You see, in 2015, we actually made agreements with Iran so that they would abandon their nuclear research, right? But Donald Trump thought it was great just to exit out of that and let Iran start enriching uranium again. Anyway, so right now, well, that's sort of off the table now, isn't it? But we'll get into why. But it was very, very interesting, and I was quite optimistic when I heard that these talks had resumed. You know, but as we'll talk about later, the war between Hamas and Israel has pretty much put an end to that, because U.S. lawmakers, a lot of them have started calling for war with Iran. I think they were already itching to do it, but now they have an excuse. Well, what else did we see? We saw the hot labor summer, didn't we? And by hot labor summer, I'm talking about strikes. Oh, strikes. Yeah. Hot labor. Anyway, I like labor. You know, I'm a fan of labor. And this is reversing power too, isn't it? It's reversing power in favor of labor for once. So what did we see? We saw the Writers Guild of America, WGA, and the Screen Actors Guild, right? The SAG-AFTRA strike, right? WGA is the writers, SAG is the actors. So the WGA, the Writers Guild, voted to strike on May 2nd, just after Pluto went retrograde, right? And over, pay, because streaming services were essentially denying them any compensation. And then movie studios also threatened to use AI, artificial intelligence, in place of writers and maybe even actors in some instances. So, but SAG-AFTRA, right, that's the actors, they just reached a tentative agreement, while the Writers Guild is still working on it. So hopefully we see a resolution there. And then the United Auto Workers, the UAW, led by my hero, Shawn Fain. He's so dreamy, Shawn Fain. That's what a real man looks like to me. Someone who sticks up for the vulnerable and the oppressed. Someone who fights power because they recognize what's right. I love this man. Someone who's committed to fighting on behalf of those who are weaker. But, so anyway, my daddy Shawn declared on September 14th that the UAW, United Auto Workers, would simultaneously strike against the big three auto producers, which is Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. Right? This is the first time in the whole union's history this ever happened. So it really is sort of a David versus Goliath scenario. But what's truly amazing about this is President Joe Biden went down to the picket line and essentially sided with workers. Now, well, it'll be interesting to see if he actually does anything substantive from that. But this was the first time in U.S. history that a president went down to a picket line on the side of the workers. Some of you might know, I think it was Pete Seeger, right? Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on? Right? Which side are you on? And this is a time in history when sides get really they get drawn, and very starkly. So, well, other news that we had to do with rule abuse, right? Rule abuse, which is very Plutonian. So in May, a report came out that 451 Illinois Catholic clergy truly abused nearly 2,000 children over 70 years. And later that month, a jury found Danny Masterson guilty of 2 counts of forcible R-word, right? For those of you who don't remember, Danny Masterson was one of the stars of that 70s show. He's also a Scientologist and was engaged in a lot of these situations for many years. And I can say that because he was found guilty. Well, also in June, manosphere influencer Andrew Tate was indicted on charges of human trafficking in Romania. That's pretty wild, right? Oh, and just recently, allegations regarding Russell Brand and the R word came to light as well. So we can see these Plutonian themes. Well, and then of course, this is sort of what I made this video to talk about. Then of course we have the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And it sharpened even more during this time. You see, in June, the Israeli government made it easier to approve settlements. That is, settlements encroaching on Palestinian land in the West Bank. Even the Biden administration could see how volatile this situation was, and they released a statement that they were deeply troubled by this decision. And then just following that, 4 Israeli settlers were killed in a shooting at a gas station in the West Bank. In response, loads and loads and loads of settlers rioted in Palestinian villages around the West Bank, indiscriminately beating people and torching cars. In fact, the settler violence would continue and get deadly as it escalated, to the point where the U.S., the most staunch supporter of Israel, even openly condemned it. The UN released a report at the end of September that over 1,100 Palestinians had been displaced by Israeli settler violence since 2022. Well, so what happens is Pluto goes direct, right? Let's talk about some of this stuff. Number 1, Trump's legal battles seem to be getting worse, don't they? But it hasn't hurt his popularity at all, apparently, among his base at least. In fact, Republicans, like I said, want to make him the Speaker of the House. It's so funny because this other guy, Jim Jeffries, was going to be running for Speaker. And when he was asked, well, what about Trump doing it? He said, well, I'd rather Trump be president. And the interviewer, Sean Hannity, said, well, he could be president too. And Jim Jeffries was such a little bit that he was like, oh yeah, he could do both. That would be great. Like, you just see how these people just fall on their knees. Fall on your knees. It's not even Christmas yet. So, anyway. I think it's likely that he could appeal his fraud conviction in New York. Or it could come out that he's barred from doing business. So we'll see what happens. Also, Ron DeSantis, little Rob DeSantis, his campaign is pretty much over. We're going to see the other Republican candidates drop out bit by bit now that Pluto's direct. And we'll see Trump slowly come back, is my prediction, even though I'm not happy about it. We've also seen the Republican Party pretty much devolve into disarray since Pluto went retrograde, sort of culminating recently with the ouster of Kevin McCarthy, Republican Kevin McCarthy, who was the Speaker of the House. And I really do think we could see Republicans in general coalesce once again around Trump. Ooh, and then speaking of Elon Musk, right? He's now being sued for defamation after pushing more false information. This time about a young man whose life had been turned upside down from accusations by the far right that he was some sort of government provocateur engaged in false flags and all kinds of nonsense like that. Well, poor guy. He couldn't even return home. I also think that we'll continue to see labor power grow. especially as Pluto goes back into Aquarius, right? I think that we'll see tentative agreements between the UAW and the Big Three this year. I think they've already made a lot of inroads with Ford, if I'm not mistaken. So as for abuse news, I think it's likely that UK authorities will bring formal charges against Russell Brand. Okay, so now this is what we are sort of going to focus on now, okay? Because this is the big elephant in the room. This is what's really going to get bigger and will probably encompass our attention or engross our attention for a while, okay? And I'm talking about Israel-Palestine, the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it's impossible to bring this up without upsetting people, right? But facts and history really matter when it comes to this. It's also important that we denounce harming civilians, ever, regardless of who does it. And yes, I do condemn any sort of harming of civilians. But we need to talk about the history here too, right? People often say this conflict between Israel and Palestine goes back thousands of years, which isn't true. It doesn't. It goes back really to the late 1800s. But we'll get to that in a second. And really the climax of it goes back to 1948. What does go back thousands of years, though, is the oppression, expulsion, and genocide of the Jews. You know what I'm saying, genocide, right? I have to be careful with my speech because I'll get in trouble. So, and it's important to recognize this because the oppression, expulsion, and genocide of the Jews, of the Jewish people, has been happening since antiquity. They were taken prisoner by the Babylonians. And what was that? 650 BCE or something like that. They were decimated by the Romans. In fact, it was the Romans who changed the name of the nation of Judea to Palestine in order to erase Jewish history from the Levant, which was what that area was called, the Levant. Some people call it the Holy Land, right? I mean, that's sort of dated, you know. A lot of us just now call it Israel or Palestine. See? Anyway, so they changed the name in order to erase Jewish history from the land and any claim to it. In fact, the Jews were murdered throughout Christendom in the Middle Ages. And they were even blamed for the bubonic plague, or what we call the Black Death, which was a major pandemic that killed about half the European population. Well, the Jews were expelled from most of Western European nations as well, and a lot of them settled in Eastern Europe, which became a safe haven in the 1600s. So this is just a little bit about what we call the Jewish diaspora, but plenty of other horrific events would befall the Jews between then and the crescendo that we reached during Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So you see, Zionism was already a movement before then, in the late 1800s. And it was the movement to establish a Jewish homeland, given this awful history that I just mentioned. But it really took off following the Holocaust, because none of the nations wanted to take on Jewish refugees after the Holocaust. Even the United States turned many away, right? FDR said it was against national security at the time. Well, and that brings us to World War I, though. So you see, the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire, it was a long-standing empire that controlled much of the territory in the Middle East, including Israel, Palestine, right? The Levant. The British wanted that territory, though, because it was very, very advantageous. And in fact, they made an agreement with local Arabs to overthrow the Ottomans in exchange for the British establishing an Arab homeland, right? And you may recognize some of this story from Lawrence in Arabia, right? Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, was involved in a lot of this stuff, right? So it was during the war, World War I, that the British made plans to carve up the Middle East. And they essentially drew the boundaries of countries we now know as Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. At the same time, the British went back on their promise to the Arabs and issued what's called the Balfour Declaration. And this outlined Britain's commitment to establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So following this, Israeli settlers began moving to Palestine. And of course, that pissed off a lot of the locals, the Arabs, the Palestinians. And there were uprisings. There were revolts, right, about this. But the British troops squashed them. And even, in fact, began arming Jewish settlers and training them so that they could forcibly expel these folks. So the British eventually bailed on Israel-Palestine, right? Leaving a mess they left when they ran away. It's not fair for Britain to deny it, right? I know it's not funny, but I like to make fun of things. So following World War II, fast forwarding a little bit, and the Holocaust, the problem was sort of left up to the UN because no one else wanted to deal with it. And there was a proposal for 2 separate states in 1947. But then 1948 happened. 1948. In which settlers and militant groups began to violently force Palestinians from their villages. And this became known as the Nakba. It was the violent, forcible removal of Palestinian people, but also symbolized their return. Because when Palestinian villagers were forced out of their homes, many of them brought their keys with them because they thought they were coming back. So now, in Nakba demonstrations, the Palestinian people carry keys to symbolize their return. Eventually, Palestinians were forced out at gunpoint, and many were even killed in the process. Over time, the land that the Palestinians were allowed to settle became smaller and smaller and smaller as new Israeli settlements popped up. This violence has been going on ever since, but it's important to note, right, that the 2 areas now designated for Palestinians, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, have been eroding now. And I mean, eroding in terms of their boundaries. And Gaza now, for all intents and purposes, is an open-air prison. There's no free movement of goods, of electricity, water, or food, or medicine, or anything like this. A lot of this can be controlled by the occupying power. So, and this is important stuff we have to mention. I'm not both sidesing this in any way. I'm merely expressing the valid points and the history from both sides, right? So, on the final days of Pluto being retrograde in Capricorn, right, which is just the past few days, Hamas, which is a militant Palestinian organization, right? Hamas invaded Israel by land, by sea, and by air. What's important to note here too is Mars was perfecting a square to Pluto during this time, which is often an indicator of violence. So as I said, Hamas invaded Israel by land, by sea, by air, but it's worth noting that these air attacks were just dudes on hang gliders, which, and it's not funny, but I think we all need to join in with condemning anyone who willfully harms civilians, regardless of who they are. And Hamas did innocent civilians, including children. and took, hundreds hostage. But we also have to look at the long history of the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, also killing Palestinian children indiscriminately as well. And both are indefensible. However, you can look over the past 80 years and see that the Palestinian people have gotten progressively more desperate. And I encourage you all to look at a timeline of just the past year of events and see how many people have been killed, right? Another thing worth mentioning is that the country of Egypt claims that they warned the Israeli government about the attack just days before. And they claim that the Israeli government ignored the warning, which of course gives us the implication that they let it happen. But there's no evidence of that, and Israel denies ever being warned. So here we are. What happens next? Well, I don't foresee anything good happening, at least in the foreseeable future. But the situation wasn't sustainable either. In response to the Hamas attack, the Israeli defense minister said that he was imposing a complete siege on Gaza. He said that there will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. Wow. If Israel could do that, then obviously there is an equal footing here in this relationship. The defense minister even followed up by calling the Palestinians human animals, which shows he doesn't even think of them as human. Another scary thing about this is the entangled international alliances. So, most of the West supports Israel, especially the United States. And a lot of this has to do with who likes who, right? For example, India's government just is very biased against Muslims because of their own situation. So they support Israel. Not because they just love Israel. But on the other hand, Iran has historically supported Palestine. And you may remember that I mentioned the US had resumed nuclear talks, at least indirectly, with Iran. But that effort is probably dead. In fact, many US politicians have called for a war with Iran, saying that they had funded and helped mastermind the attack on Israel. But a war with Iran could instigate a wider conflict, and that wouldn't be a good idea for anyone. Nuclear powers and nuclear weapons make things much, much scarier than they need to be. So, why did I talk about this event? Because it's very important as astrologers to be aware of how history corresponds to astrology. Also, seeing how aspects and events correlate is part of how we develop efficacy as diviners and readers. We should be able to anticipate events, both from our sense of history and our astrological acumen. Also, because we need to be aware of this particular situation, and facts are often ignored because people get so worked up. There are disgusting takes that I've seen from both sides, I guess, although it's hard to say both sides because this is such a nuanced thing. I've seen demonstrations with people calling for genocide against the Palestinians. And many are talking about them as if they're not even human. And then we have other people calling for violence against the Jews. And anti-Semitism has been on the rise worldwide, hasn't it? I was watching one particular event in Australia, a demonstration where participants chanted horrible, horrible violent slogans against Jewish people. We have to be very, very careful here. You see, because anti-Semites, they will latch on to legitimate criticisms of the state of Israel and use that as an excuse to push their hateful agenda. So we really do have to be aware of this. And underneath the violence here is a humanitarian crisis. We can both oppose the oppression of the Palestinians and condemn violence, as well as denounce anti-Semitism. So I said Israel-Palestine is the elephant in the room, of course. What's the bigger elephant in the room? Well, it's Pluto. Why is it Pluto? Because Pluto goes back into Aquarius in January. What will this bring? Well, we don't know, but it usually brings a violent dissolution of established power relations. I've done a video on this in the past, but I'll do another as we get closer to January at least. But suffice it to say that Pluto in Aquarius often topples established power structures and then empowers smaller or weaker ones to rise up or to be on the rise, and not always in a good way. So remember that Pluto in Aquarius brought the French Revolution, which needed to happen, but it was a pretty wacky deal, wasn't it? So we saw this even happen with the Reformation, didn't we? When King Henry told the Pope, "Fuck you," and started his own Church of England. And then again, as I said, we saw this happen when the French and American merchant classes gave the finger to monarchies, effectively weakening them in the Western world. We're seeing it happen now too, when it comes to class, race, and gender power relations, right? We had Occupy, which started to bring awareness to class. We had Black Lives Matter, which began to bring attention to race. And we had Me Too, which brought attention to gender. And now, of course, trans people like myself are becoming the object of ire. And again, we see gender power relations coming up from that. So what matters here is who has the influence, who has the power. It's traditionally been based on wealth, at least for the past 250 years, hasn't it? Plutocracy. So what comes next? What's the next sort of power relation or power structure thing that we see coming up? I have no clue. But it's starting to feel a bit like the Lorax. We'll have to continue this in another video, though. And I will go through Pluto entering Aquarius and what it means. Well, so anyway, I hope this was informative for you and that you can develop your own sober and sound views of the world situation by paying attention to facts. So please like, subscribe, comment, click the bell so you get notified of my new videos. Check out my other existing videos too, because I have loads of educational content and I'm kind of interesting. So remember also that I do the best readings. It's science, right? Speaking of facts. Don't fact check me on that. YouTube will be like, well, I didn't see a scientific study. Chill out. So anyway, my contact information is below. You can also book through my website, frankielynch.com. But more importantly, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful whatever you're having.